Okay, everybody, got your prompts and.
Hello?
Okay, I think we should be all back on. Today is June 8th, 2016. I'm Gary Corbett. This is part of a series of conference calls that I started back in 2012 to document and preserve long-distance running history for future generations. Today's call will focus on the 1964 Yonkers Marathon and will be an opportunity for participants to recall not only this race but also review all aspects of the sport of long-distance running during the 1960s. Buddy Edlund's performance at this race was the best performance I ever witnessed in my life. I had just turned age 13 a week before this May 24th, 1964 race date. I was at the 5-mile mark, which I believe would have been the first water station, probably with Bill Wicklund. And one of my memories is I had never seen so many runners ahead of my father, Ted Corbett, in a marathon before. And I believe he was around 31 plus minutes for the first 5 miles. I want to read you just a few things from his diary of this race, and then a couple excerpts from letters to his one of his coaches, Dr. William Roofruff. Not from his diary: 91 degrees, humid, slight wind, field of 128, 37 finishers within 4 hours, 12th place in the national, 5th in the Met, first Met team, second man, second national team, time 3:20:32. My slowest ever marathon, carried sponge all the way, out and back course from Glen Park. Have not seen so many runners walking in over 10 years. Weak as a kitten, climbing hills. Wanted to quit race, wanted to walk last hill 1 mile from finish. Unable to account for being so far off form. Excerpt from a letter. I have thought further on my failure at Yonkers, and I had previously stated in my speculation. I think that the heat just affected me in a stronger manner. For 2 years I've worked in an air-conditioned area, and this doesn't help one to get acclimatized for running in the heat of the day. I've done most of my training in the early morning on the way to work. My after-work running has been limited. The result is probably a slow-up of acclimatization. I concluded this, and on Sunday, Joe Kleinerman sent me a clipping from a medical journal on the subject, and the author made the same point. To beat the heat, one should get acclimatized and use a lot of water before and during the race. He remarked on my poor form at the end of the Yonkers race. My form was a reflection of fatigue and poor feeling. I wanted to quit the race at about 3 miles, and the urge to quit came on several times after that. I decided to stay in the race. I lost about 100 yards going up one 300-yard hill approaching the halfway mark. I was weak and without real energy. This was unusual since I was well trained. The excessive heat probably took up a large part of the blood, leaving less blood for the muscles. An excerpt from another letter. I'd run over the new Yonkers course 3 times to study it. I knew it well. I knew how to run the course, but the knowledge was of no help in the race itself. Incidentally, in practice, I ran 3:28, 3:32, with the course being part of a longer workout as I ran up from home and back. Okay, let's get started. Again, we have 4 panelists today, and we'll have them talk about their memories of the race and other things about the sport. And then we have an audience of people who were runners during the 1960s and or people who are fans of the sport and history of the sport. So, Abe Assa, you get it started.
Okay, Gary. So, thank you for inviting me. And John, Carla, good to hear your voice after all these years.
Oh yeah,
yeah.
Yeah. All right, tell us a good one now.
Repeat what Gary said, of course.
Identify yourself.
Thing of the race is that it was brutally hot. And you can see everybody listed here with F, at least in that race, on this panel. I'd mention for questions later that I have the long and slog page of the results of the race in front of me. So if anybody has a specific question about where, certain of the finishes, I can provide that. I also happen to have the Globe page from the Boston Marathon of that year, if anybody wants to ask about finishes in that race. So, brutally hot, and I dropped out. I think it was about 8 miles. I think there was a river that ran under the street. Diverted off and went down to it and lost myself and somehow got back. I don't remember. I don't think there was much water like there is today at races, and so that made it excellent. Anyway, you get back to the finish line, and you stand there. You were there, and you wait, and finally Edlin comes in at 2:24, which is a fantastic. It's also 10 minutes off his best, though, but at the time, but still fantastic for the conditions. And he came and finished, and you waited, and you waited, and you waited, and you waited. And finally, 20 minutes later, Adolf Gruber and Johnny Kelly come onto the track in 2:44 and finish up their marathon. Everybody after that just looked like they had been through a war. And, the numbers tell it all. There were only 5 runners. This is the national championship and an Olympic trial for one. And there were only 5 runners under 4 hours and only 37 under 4 hours. So feelings, because it wasn't one spot was open for the Olympic trials, for the Olympic spot, that there was a certain mentality amongst all the elite runners of, well, there's one spot open. I'm not going to run, quote, my own race, unquote. I'm going to go for that one spot. As a result, everybody clumped around the leaders, I think, and ran as far as they could before they said, well, I'm going to save it for Culver City. And a lot of the elite dropped out to save themselves for another marathon a couple of months later. In Culver City, the same thing happened. Everybody's running for the 2 spots there, running as a clump with the leaders as far as they can because they're going for broke for the Olympic spots. And thinking back to those days compared to now, as far as running and the thinking about marathons goes, in those days, everybody who was considered themselves a marathoner, especially those east, would run Boston, and a month later, run Yonkers, and not think twice about the fact that they're running 2 marathons in a month. And in that particular year, runners were faced with running Boston, Yonkers, and make it in Yonkers. They would have had to run a 3rd marathon in July over City, and if after those 3 they were on the team, they would have had to run a 4th one in the Olympics, all within a few months. Now, that would be absolutely unheard of for somebody to approach it in that way. So that's kind of something that I always was amazed at. And now just getting away and talking about the general running scene back then, back in the early 60s, there were maybe only a few dozen runners in every district, like the Metropolitan District, the New England, the D.C., and you kind of personally knew every single runner in your district because the same ones showed up for each race generally. And if you read the long-distance slog, you knew essentially every runner in the country, at least by name. And I would say that there were probably only about, at most, 1,000 road runners in the whole country. And anyone who trained by running on the streets was a competitive racer. There was no such thing as a recreation jogger for health or exercise. And if I lived in the Bronx, somebody would tell me they saw someone running, say, on Webster Avenue and 170th Street, I would say, oh, that was probably Abe Fornes of the Pioneer Club. That's how small the running community was and how tight it was. You asked about, how am I doing on time, okay?
Yeah, you're wonderful. Keep talking.
You asked about the people who influenced me. Well, I wasn't any coach in particular or anything. I had a bad experience with a coach in high school and really didn't want to have anything to do with a coach after that. I coached myself, and that was the one reason I joined the Milrose, because in the Milrose everybody was scattered around and sort of did their own thing and showed up. Those who did influence on my running were my training partners. I lived in the Bronx, and Tom McCarthy of the New York AC and the Gaelic American Athletic Club, I trained with for 2 years. He lived a few blocks from me, and we would get together basically every single day. And he was the perfect training partner. He was always let me set the pace, and he was good enough better than me that no matter how good I felt, he would be right there. And it never turned into a case where it was a question of I was trying to make a workout into a race. I thrived with until he went back to Ireland at the end of 1965, and I sort of floundered a bit. I trained some with Jimmy O'Connell, my teammate at City College, but he was 3 miles from me. I never again had the consistency that I had with McCarthy. Bronx, during the summer months, most of the Bronx runners would gather at Van Cortlandt Park each evening. There, a loop we called the Aqueduct Loop, where there was a path over an aqueduct that came from upstate New York, and it skirted the park, and it was we would get on the path and take it up to Tibbetsburg Park in Yonkers, and wind back down into Van Cortlandt Park by another route. That's how small the running community. What running has grown into. I cannot ever have predicted it all. That it grew and grew and grew and just wasn't a passing fad. And what's surprising to me is that you had only a few runners back then, and now you have millions and millions across the whole country, yet track and field as a spectator to an abysmal spectator sport. We used to have, I think it was 3 winter indoor meets in the Garden, and the Milrose Games, and Knights of Columbus, and another one, and each one of them would pack the Garden with 18,000 people. And now, if you have an indoor meet that draws 5,000, considered a good turnout. Going back to the early days, I tell people, and they have, I'm believing it, time, at the Boston Marathon, there were no qualifying times, no female runners, a $2 entry fee, 100 runners, and as you left the Lenox Hotel to go, there were special editions of the Globe with the race results waiting for you out in the street. Pretty much what I have to.
Okay, that's good. Thank you, Abe. We got let's plan on about 10 minutes of Q&A for Abe. State your name and either for a question or a comment from all that Abe laid out for us.
Hal Higdon, I have both a comment and a question. My memory is that the entry fee at the Boston Marathon when I first ran it was $1. And at some point, Jock Semple in the mid-'60s came to me and said they needed extra money. They were thinking of doubling the fee. Would runners accept that? And I had to laugh because he was talking about a $2 entry fee, and I just probably had spent more money than I wanted to believe, flying in from Chicago and staying overnight in a hotel, and he was asking to add an extra $1 to the entry fee. What's it now cost to run the Dopey Challenge at Disney World? $500. But Abe, thank you for the summary, but particularly thank you for the memories of what running was in the past. I had one question, and that was, you were a New Yorker. The start of the race was at noon. Does this mean that you got up early and took the train out to Yonkers, or did you actually stay overnight?
No, I wouldn't stay overnight. I probably wouldn't take the train. I probably had rode up with somebody from the city that morning. 12 noon in May. That's what it's hard to.
Other questions? Comments?
Yeah, this is John Gollop. I don't remember any water on the course when I ran the race, and I made it to about 20 miles, but then I had to pack it in because I started getting chills, and I knew when I get that I was in trouble. But did you see water on the course? I mean, somebody said at 5 miles somebody gave somebody water.
Harry said that Ted had in his diary. I don't remember water on the course.
I don't.
I think I would. I think I was. You know, water was so. This is Gary. Water was so infrequent during this era. I'm pretty sure I was at a water stop at 5 miles. But how many water stops do you recall?
Well, this is Hal Higdon again. I got a little bit of information on that because looking at my own diary, I made a comment that there was like a blizzard of water in the early 10 miles, and then after 10 miles when I needed it, there was hardly anything. And it was being given in these little paper cups, perforated cups that you could grab them and you spilled half of it. At the same time, Buddy was doing a much better job than we were of hydrating himself. He had really focused on training with water when he was back in England, and Fred Wilt, of course, was accompanying Buddy, myself handing out water. So basically, I think the international rules claim that you could not give water, at least in the first 15 kilometers. So theoretically, there was a rule against having fluid on the course, which we bumped up against when we went to Alamosa in 4 years later when they refused to allow water to be distributed, even though people were there willing to give it out.
They really? Oh, I remember Pete McArdle telling me about the situation at Culver City where, again, there was a whole clump of runners running, and they would descend on a water station, and there'd be one person holding one of those flimsy cups, and one out of the clump got it, and he lost half of it with the cup crushing under the grab. And I think in Culver City, everybody totally dehydrated in the last between the last 10 and 5 miles.
Maybe I'm getting the two races confused, but there was also an anecdote involving, the Canadian runner who won Boston so many times, running in the Yonkers race and in the lead, and they were positioning the cups of water on the fence in the track, and he came by and knocked them all off so nobody behind him could have any water.
Yeah, this is Jim Green. I don't remember water either at Yonkers, though there might have been. Maybe I was just so focused on the heat. But I do know in Boston in '68, when Amby Burford won, I remember desperately wanting water. It was very warm, and people were handing out lots of oranges, and I couldn't find any water. So I think throughout a lot of the 60s, there was very little water. I don't know what the official arrangement was, but I gathered that there was no fixed rule on how much water could be given out or where it could be given out.
And I've got a comment on that too, Jimmy. Good to talk to you again, because that was the year when Dave Kostel did his first experiments with rehydration, and a bunch of us, Amby included, went to Muncie, Indiana, and ran 3 bouts of 20 miles on the treadmill while he handed us no water, and Gatorade. And David was actually at Boston that year passing out water and Gatorade probably to those of us who were in the study, and that included Amby Burfoot, although I believe Amby didn't take much because he thought it was a bad idea. And we certainly learned from all that we have been taught over the ages as we went through the 70s and 80s, and running became more and more popular, and I think you can look at some of the reasons why runners are now running 2:03 was because of the science that's available today versus when we were sort of doing it our own way.
That's a good analysis, Hal. I didn't know the word hydration, I don't think, in the 60s. And oftentimes was very sparing in the amount of water that I would take. Somewhat too afraid that I was going to get my shoes wet and they would slow me down.
Plus, you were a sissy, too, if you took water. I mean, Zatopek didn't need water. Why would we need water?
Right, exactly.
Temple
you
take care
guys
of you
talking
guys out
about
of the course with his own water supply.
Buddy Edlin, I also learned as a coach now, but he trained in double sweats because he saw that there was a chance of heat in Yonkers. That's why he was prepared, I think, better than anybody else. As far as I know,
3
when
and 4
I read it.
suits, actually. Not just one double, triple, quadruple.
Yeah,
the log article says 5 layers.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
Mate. But I always, I had my runners now. When we go to different races, I tell them to look up what the worst weather could be, and that would be hot and humid. If that's the case, we got to run with extra sweats, and it's worked out great.
That's a good idea. Yeah.
And of course, today's runners now show up at the starting line wearing ice vests to remain as cool as possible until the gun goes off.
Yeah.
I've never seen that. That's amazing. I'm amazed always seeing people, even in cool weather, with these vests with 3-5 bottles of water with them, and I wonder how they can run with that weight. I would never put that kind of encumbrance on me because I thought I might need water in the middle of the race.
The runners back then would make Foreign Legion type hats from painter's cap and a rag.
Yeah, that was my highlight in the 58 Boston Marathon. He wore this kind of what do you call it? Middle Eastern combination around his head, and went on to win by about 5 or 6 minutes at Boston. But he was second.
And at Yonkers, of course, Buddy was wearing I believe, from looking at the pictures, a handkerchief with knots on 4 corners, which is a common headpiece we had back then.
Exactly. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Abe, you ran Culver City, correct?
Yes, I ran Culver City also.
Okay, and Jim, you also were at Culver City. Hal, did you do Culver City?
Yeah, and I actually finished the race too, believe it or not.
Okay.
It was a rough last 5 miles, though, wasn't it, Hal?
Pardon?
It was a rough
I had a very bad last 5 miles, yeah. I was running with Peter and Billy at 20, but by the time I got to the finish line, I think they'd finished about 5 miles ahead of me.
Any last comments, questions for Abe?
I think that's an excellent analysis by Abe about how conditions were at the time, and the entry fee is amazing, from $1 to $2 to hundreds now. Yeah.
Who's talking now?
Jimmy.
Yeah.
Okay, Jim.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Jimmy.
Okay.
But you guys forget about the track meets now. This is John Gollop. You guys forget about the track meets. It only costs 25 cents to run a 6-miler.
Who got the profits? I never know.
Okay, Jim Green, you have the floor.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Boy, I could just put a ditto mark after what Abe said. Partly we know each other very well because he's probably the only training partner I've ever had. Throughout all my competitive years, I ran alone. There was nobody else around here to run with. I can remember many a time coming in from a workout and saying, telling whoever was around, I saw somebody running on Route 1 where I trained. And this was always a surprise. I never saw anybody running when I go off for workouts, possibly once every couple of weeks. During the recent 13-year period when I was running, from age 58 to 71, I trained around the Charles River. And the Charles River then and today, much worse. We never had that many runners in a few hundred yards during a race as they have today around the Charles River. It is a very competitive field that runs around this river. And but before then, again, it would be a very big surprise to see anybody. Al Confalone, who finished fourth at Boston, and the fourth Pan Americans. Anyways, he lived a couple of towns over, but he was a craftsman and I was a teacher. And of course, the hours available for training were much better for teaching than for his work. But anyways, we trained possibly 4 or 5 times in the 20 years that I knew him in running, and we just trained alone. Right now, as I hobble out for a workout, maybe a few dozen times a year, I meet Abe, and we run together. And much of what I have experienced, success-wise, frustration-wise, Abe knows about it. He's heard my stories 5 times over, and I suspect if I start to tell a story, that he will pipe in and say, "Jim, you forgot such and such." So training with a colleague was just something that didn't happen. It truly was the so-called loneliness of the long-distance runner. And I think sometime, too, that one of the advantages I had in my racing was that when I trained alone, I would do probably every other day all out and run to my limit on the watch. And sometimes, and I run at that time 6 days a week, and 3 or 4 times a week. Again, it would be flat out, and I think that is one advantage there was in my training, because when I had company, when I was in a field of runners, it felt so great to have this competition, but to push yourself to the limit, running alone. It gave me greater discipline, and I think I ran better as a result of it. I don't know what else I can add to it. Some of the things Abe said were my experiences, though, I lived a couple of miles from him. One thing in relation to Yonkers, though I ran terribly that day, well, everybody did because of the heat, except Buddy Edelin, of course, was a phenomenal achievement. I vaguely remember, it seemed to me, being in a field of about 8 runners at about 8 miles. It's vague in my mind. It's probably a race I quickly suppressed the recollection of it, but I don't remember any water. I do remember my feet blistering a little bit around the 8 mile mark, and I remember asking some people, bystanders, if they knew where a drugstore was that I could run into it and get a jar of Vaseline. There was partly this was an excuse because I was running poorly, overcome by the heat, and partly too in the 58 Boston Marathon where Mihalik won, and I think about 2:25. My feet were blistering badly. Jock Semple had given me some tough skin to put on my feet, but because I didn't wear socks then, my feet started to pull away from the shoe at each step. I could feel the skin pulling at the bottom of the shoe, and Tom Dedarian writes it up in his book. Around the 16-mile mark, just over Route 128, there was a gas station, and I ran into the gas station, and I saw all this. I mean, I had the thought in mind at that point, all this axle grease. So I took my shoes off, greased my feet, went out, and continued running. And because 3 people had dropped out, I ended up running 11th that day. 3 people that were disqualified. One more difference from today, at least probably up to 58. There were never any doctors there to take your pulse or heart. I don't remember how many times before that, but of course in 58 is famous for 3 of the finest marathoners in the country, and I think the first among those 3 was Ted Corbett, Gary's father. Carl Confalone, who was 4th in 1960, and then and on the Pan American team, and then John Lafferty, who was first American in Boston in the early 50s. So those 3 are disqualified because some errant heart message the doctors detected. Also, one small side note, I ran Yonkers in 60. I ran badly and put off the Olympic team. But in Yonkers Hospital, about a dozen years before then, no, I'll take that back, in 44 to be exact, my wife was born in that Yonkers Hospital. So though Yonkers was not a good race venue for me, I did get a wife out of it, and we're still together after 51 years. So anyways, a lot of good memories and some bad ones at Yonkers.
Thanks, Jim. Questions for Jim?
Sure. Yeah, one small side note, too. In 58, John Lafferty and I were asked by Jock Semple to run with this, not really a novice runner, but he had not run in the country before. That was Mihalik. And they took us out to the 10-mile mark, and John and I stepped out of the car tentatively with Franjo next to us, and we ran down to almost Cleveland Circle, about 22 miles. And as soon as our feet touched the street, about the 10-mile mark, he took off. He took off. John and I looked at each other, not believing that somebody could be that fast. And he left us in the dust. Then we got into the car near Cleveland Circle. The car met us, and Franjo said, I know a little Russian. He said, "Et the konets. This is the end," looking at a graveyard. So that was, I don't think humor came easily to Eastern Europeans at that time.
Before Jimmy gets off too far, let me tell my favorite Jimmy Green story. And it was in one of my annual Boston disasters, somewhere before or after Wellesley. We were running near each other, and things had begun to go south for me. And we crossed over a writing on the wall that said slow. And I made the comment, I already am going slow. And all of a sudden, Jim's head went boing, as though he had been hit, because I had broken the code of silence and actually tried to talk to somebody in the middle of a race. One would never talk to anybody back then.
No, exactly. Right. Yeah, that's right, Hal. Yeah. Yeah, there were no any familiarities traded or suggestions or... I once heard from one runner, maybe it's Jimmy Daly, was a very good miler in high school, saying something about, I caught up to him and he said, "This is too fast." He said, "You're going to ruin it. You're going to blow it." So, but again, there was a kind of code of silence. You're right. You never traded any ideas or secrets.
Jimmy.
Yes. Yeah.
When you mentioned about the 3 runners that were rejected by the position, did you mention that they ran the race?
Oh yes,
anyway?
I'm sorry. My mind is Good, Abe. Yeah, they ran anyways. They got about 150 yards behind the field and came in. I not finished that story. And it was something like 6th, 7th, and 9th. I think that Ted come in 6th. I can't imagine running in a marathon on a hot day as that was. I think it was 84 degrees. And saying you're DQ'd, you can't run. And they just still got in the race and ran super.
Jim, it's Gary. What's your proudest running accomplishment?
Who is this directed to?
Jim.
You, Jim.
Oh, yeah. Okay. My 2:23 and 60 was my best, on paper. But I think in 64, Olympic tryout in Culver City, I didn't decide to run the race until 2 weeks before because my training had been very bad throughout the year and I had a few bad races. But I did decide at the last minute. Chuck Semple had raised the money, and I do remember my feet blistering about 16 miles. I'm running next to somebody named Joe Tyler. It's funny. 12 years earlier, against Joe Tyler, running in a junior college race, Joe Tyler and I were supposed to be, sharp competitors. Well, Joe just ran away from me completely in a 2-mile race in Compton. So here we are at 16 miles, 12 years later, and fighting it out. Anyways, my feet blistered, and somehow the blisters after a couple of miles went away, and I was able to finish third. And that's my proudest race, I guess, because I was able to hang on, though my training had been kind of weak.
You mentioned Joe Tyler. I would love to find him. He's part of my African American history timeline.
He might have had a 6-mile
I ran against
record.
Joe in 1956. It was in the Compton Invitational, and he and Max Truex whipped me in a 5,000-meter race. He was an excellent runner, and I'm just wondering if maybe he did not have the opportunity to be as good as he could have been because we had an amateur sport back then that he would not have gotten the support that somebody would have gotten from our shoe companies today.
Yeah, right. I agree completely. You had a big range, so you can describe a lot of races. A lot of the old marathoners did not have that kind of speed that you had, and it certainly had to be a great asset in running the much slower pace of a marathon. Yeah, that's another major difference. At that time, so many college runners, if they ran road races, would do badly, even if they were reasonably good or 2 mile, 3 mile races, because they didn't do the meters then. But you could do that, and that certainly made you a much better racer, Hal.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Are there any other questions or comments for Jim?
Well, this is John Gollop. The only about Yonkers, that 12 o'clock thing is what made that race tough. Because they always had hot weather. If they would have started, they finally changed it, but that 12 noon, that's what made that a tough race.
Killer.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And to the rest of you guys, none of us guys run slow. We only run easy, medium, and hard, okay? This is from the coach from the Milrose.
Yeah, right.
Does anybody recall that day in Yonkers any discussion of an earlier race start? To get the word out to everybody would have been difficult, but or canceling a race, I guess that would be an issue because people have traveled in for it, but any of that kind of discussion recall?
I don't think so.
I doubt if they would have been able to make that change.
Yeah.
I think partly, too, because the Boston Marathon started at noon. A lot of races, at least in New England, were influenced by that. So a good many races, at least on the weekend, started at noon.
But Culver City, Jim, if I remember correctly, started at 8 a.m.
Was it that early? I would have thought more like 9, but I'm not. I'm not.
That's off my diary, my training log.
Oh, is it really 8 o'clock? Wow! I hate to run very early. Still do.
They started at 8. The Boston Marathon?
No. Culver City Marathon, the Western Hemisphere Marathon, the Olympic trial in '64.
Yeah, but Boston usually had, at least in the 60s, this is John Gollop, the first time I went up there in '61, it was snowing. It wasn't a heavy snow,
I remember
but,
that.
it's cooler.
I remember snow coming down.
Yeah, it was a light snowfall. And,
right.
But I think toward the late 60s, it started getting hot weather. That's when it got rough. But about 60, 68, 69, 70, and then they really had some brutal days. But before that, I thought the weather up there was great.
Yeah. Well, I remember a little bit of rain in '62 at the end of the race. I really made it very hard finishing. And 68 again, Amby Burford won the race in warm weather. Kelly won his 57 marathon, the 2:20:05 or something in hot weather, very warm weather, at least low 70s, and he won by over 3 minutes. And then that's another thing too, winning by over 3 minutes. The gaps in races were much bigger then, partly because there are fewer competitors, and there were a few people that stood out, like Kelly, that at least in New England would win a lot of races by large margins.
Yeah, but still, Oxanen, you remember him?
Oh, yes.
He won it, I think, 3 times.
Yeah, sure.
But I think Kelly would have beat all of these guys. All the American runners had a regular job, and they trained, right? These guys they bring them over here almost a month, I think, ahead of time, and all they did was run. And I think those guys are running 30 miles a day when they were running, and they probably took days off. But the fact is, the brute force. I mean, I think Johnny Kelly probably would have ran under 2:12 if he had something like that. No, I really, he was talented, and I just feel, and there were other American runners, the same thing, that had if you have a full, your job, and you got to go to work every day, and then you still got to train, and and you get your family and everything. It's not as easy. I think there was a advantage there. At least that's the way I felt about it.
This is Jim Green again. Still having too much time, I think, especially if you use it excessively, can be a detriment. I do remember when the 2 Ethiopians, Bekele and Volde, come over, and I knew there was a doctor whose house they stayed at, Warren Guile, and he was a kidney doctor. Anyway, and he ran the marathon into 3 hours. Seemed like not many runners that took marathoning seriously would run over 3 hours. Well, anyways, they lived with him. I remember him telling me they ate him at a house and home. And, of course, I don't know how much time they had. I think they were here a few weeks before. And, you see what happened. One of them come in 5th, Bekele, and Volde, I think, 12th in the 63 marathon. I don't mean too much time disadvantage. I just mean that you certainly have to use that time well. But an advantage for me and Kelly and Sapienza, who ran some great 10-mile races, and he finished 4th at Boston in '58. They were teachers. We had this extra time. Al Gonfalone would, especially during the winter time, would be home at 5 p.m., and, training in the dark, which to me was a great disadvantage. And but being a teacher was just the perfect background for running, because you'd be busy part of the day, and it was, of course, much more cerebral work than so many other people. And I think this helped us to better results. And then the whole summer off. Yeah.
Okay,
yeah, no,
we're gonna let's move on. We'll come back to some of this maybe in a discussion upcoming.
Sure.
But thank you. Hal, you got the floor. Hal Higdon.
Okay, and of course, finishing up what Jim was just saying, Buddy Edelin, of course, was a teacher over England, living 5.5 miles away from his school, and he would usually do a run to school in the morning, and then in the evening he would take a longer run home, sometimes with the interval training on the track. Anyway, previewing the talk that we were planning today, I looked at some of the things that I had written over the years about Yonkers. That included some comments in On the Run from Dogs and People. I did a profile of Buddy Edelin for the August 1982 The Runner, and of course my own diaries, and I've shared with Gary copies of the half dozen diary pages that I had that talked about my running in Yonkers. I'm not sure if they have been shared with any of you, but if you want to see some later, I can always provide those. My whole mindset going into the 1964 training or racing season was I had run in the Olympic trials in 52, 56, 60 without great success. Didn't make the team. So my focus entirely that year, during the winter of the year, was to Boston. I wanted to go to Boston and win Boston arrogantly, and I felt that I could run sub 225, and that may or may not have been fast enough, but I wanted to really be in the mix. So the Olympic trials in Yonkers were really not on my horizon at that point, but having run well at Boston, I sort of rethought myself. One of the reasons why I hadn't really thought about Yonkers was, of course, there was only one position being given, and Buddy Edelin was so much better than anybody else, any other American, including myself, that, unless he totally crashed, he was going to nab that position. And after running well at Boston, I thought, well, he could totally crash, so maybe I ought to at least show up and be there waiting in the wings if he had to walk off the course for any reason. Yonkers not being a very, very difficult course, it could trip anybody. But nevertheless, Buddy was so superbly trained. He came over there, really ready to run. His mindset was that the rest of us, Jim Green, Abe, and myself, didn't really belong on the course with him. That was his attitude, and I'm reflecting off of what I also read in Frank Murphy's book about Buddy. So he was basically there just to beat us up, and he started out very, very conservatively. Backing up, I suspect I was staying at a motel outside town with Fred Wilt and Buddy. Of course, Fred coached both of us by mail. I was a little bit closer by mail to Fred Wilt than Buddy was, and so I don't have a lot of memories. I can't even remember our starting on the track. I just read it, and I said, did we really start on the track? I sort of vaguely recalled that we had a different course than the standard brutal Yonkers course, which was an out and back along 9A or whatever it's called. I'm not that familiar with the New York City roads, but I do sort of remember being out there in the early miles, and there was a pack of runners that were running up in the lead, and Buddy was running very, very conservatively for the first 10 miles. And I remember, again, relating to what I wrote in my diary, I felt uncomfortable running in the pack. So at one point, 5-6 miles into the race, I sort of got out of the front pack, dropped back about 50 yards, and allowed myself to run together with the front group ahead. And then coming up around 10 miles, I felt I was a little bit worried that Buddy might sort of take off on us, and I was going to get dropped. So I sort of pulled back up into the lead pack, and Fred Wilt, of course, was running along with us in his car, and he was offering congratulations to both of us, and I guess providing water, although I also said in my diary that I didn't bother to take any water for the first 10 miles, which was really totally stupid of me if Fred was giving it out. And at about 10 miles, Buddy just took off. And, he increased the pace, and nobody was capable of going with him. So at that point, we were basically all also ran, and we were going to sort of pick up whatever scraps were left over, and unless Buddy himself self-destructed, which was, of course, possible, then, he had the Olympic spot, and the rest of us, might as well do what Dave did and get off the course early and look for another day's running. And I sort of stayed reasonably close, at least with him in sight, at least for a few, 4, 5, 6 miles, whatever it was. And I remember running with Norm Higgins, and Johnny Kelly was with me about that time, and I think I probably drifted from second to third to fourth to third back to second or whatever it was. And at one point then, Norm Higgins took off in chasing Buddy. And again, reflecting on my own diary, I think it was like I heard that Higgins was like at one point maybe 16 or 17 miles. Higgins was 3 minutes ahead of me, and Buddy Edelin was 5 minutes ahead of me. And at about that point, it was around 17 miles, and I'm thinking Johnny Kelly came by me at about that time, and my ears started to ring. And that bothered me, so I slowed down, and the ringing went away. And so I speeded back up to normal pace, and my ears started to ring again. And I slowed down, maybe even walked, and the ringing went away. Got back into pace, ringing again, and I sort of realized I was about to have a heat stroke unless I got off this course, which I then did at about 17 miles. At that point, Buddy was just away from us flying. Norm Higgins would have been in second place at that point, and he ran well until 23 miles, and I think it's more than a legend. I wrote back both in my diary and other things I wrote. At 23 miles, the course turned left, and he went straight and hit a brick wall and wound up in the hospital for the next week, just about, literally almost killed himself. Johnny Kelly, God love him, had a good day considering everything was. He finished, but he was like, 20 minutes, behind Buddy. If anything, I think Buddy made a major mistake. If I had been a coach running alongside him, I would have told him, wait, at 10 miles, you don't want to go off this early. Let's wait to 20, and then you can take off. But I think Buddy was a little bit nervous. I think there was a little bit of a confidence gap there, and he was afraid that if he allowed some of the faster runners to stay with him up until the last 2 miles, he would get out-kicked, which is really ridiculous because he was at such higher level than even Norm Higgins, who was running very, very well at that time, and John Kelly, we all know how good he was. But I think really he made a major mistake and just ran too hard. I mean, there was no real excuse. I don't know what Fred was thinking. He should have slowed him down to finish 3 miles in front of the second-place runner. And although Buddy ran reasonably well at the Olympics and then ran another 2:15, I believe it was at the Poly the following year, he never quite achieved that level of ability that he had. It sort of ran away from him. I'm thinking of both Alberto Salazar and Dick Beardsley hammering against each other in 1982. Alberto pretty much destroyed himself in that race, and Dick did too. So I think we all remember Jim Peters, of course, crashing at the umpire game. So sometimes we need to be protected from ourselves and the heat and the horrible heat. And let me tell one other story about a teammate of mine. You said, I forget who said it earlier, that only 5 people ran under 3 hours. Harold Harris was a teammate of mine and friend of mine. We used to train together at the University of Chicago Track Club, and Harold was there, and he was a pretty good runner, but he wasn't in that great level of shape at that time. So Harold started off very, very conservatively, and he was having a horrible day, and they were announcing from the side, well, you're in like 60th place. and then he'd get a few miles down the road, and they say you're in 45th place, and then a few miles beyond that, and now you're in 20th place and 10th place, and suddenly 4th place, and Harold couldn't understand it because he wasn't passing anybody. Everybody that was out in front of Harold in the first few miles was walking off the course, like the three of us, and Harold wound up finishing 4th, basically because he had run a nice, slow, conservative race, and 2:55, nice performance given the day. And then I have to talk about Holyoke, which we were going to talk about 3 years, but the anecdote fits in real well back then. I sort of went into semi-retirement after 65, didn't really run too hard, but continued to run recreationally. So in 67, I was in Boston area on business for some reason I've totally forgotten, the same weekend as Mount Holyoke. So I either rented a car or got to Mount Holyoke some way and entered the race. I have the feeling I just walked up and filed my entry the same day and started off at a Harold Harris pace, certainly 7 minutes or slower, and the same thing happened to me. I was being told I was in 50th place, 25th place, and eventually 13th place, I guess I finished, and I never passed anybody. So basically, slow and easy sometimes gets the job done for you. It's really sort of unfortunate with hindsight that they would suggest schedule an Olympic trial in May, noon, with the possibility of hot and humid weather that you could almost expect in New York at that time. Also, over one of the most devilishly difficult courses in America, although I guess they sanitized it for the purposes of the trials that year and then went back to the old traditional race. But, we were learning, and then, like I say, along came Dave Kossel in 1968 with his experiments for Gatorade, and now we wouldn't think of running a race without having aid stations every mile or two. I think Boston was the last holdout in 1978, the year after Jerome Drayton won the race and complained so visibly about Billy getting fluids from his wife, but they weren't giving any to him other than what Billy shared with him. And the BAA was mortified and anger and, that damn Canadian. But the next year they had water on the course, and things got better from then. And I guess today's runners don't really understand how good they have it, finishing in 4, 5, 6 hours. God love them. Bill Rogers once made the comment, he said he couldn't imagine how difficult it would be to be running a marathon and have to stay on the course 4 hours. So I hope I've covered some of the subject. Glad to answer any questions you might have for me.
That's a wonderful description, Hal. This is Jim Green. I've often wondered what happened in the Yonkers Marathon. I never knew what was going on in front of me, and to this day, long have I wondered exactly, what the competition was going on in front of me. So,
well, the only competition was Buddy blasting his butt off, and he was not too comfortable in the last couple of miles either. I'm not sure if he wound up walking, but he ran the last mile or so pretty slow.
I agree completely, too. Sometime a more conservative pace at the beginning, especially when it's a hot day, can sometime work wonders. And the kind of exhilaration you feel as you pass one person.
Hal, you had mentioned, this is Gary, that Norm Higgins ended up in the hospital. Ron Dawes also ended in the hospital twice that evening. He was staying with the Cyrilniks, and he had some issues. Does anybody else recall people ending up in the hospital after that race?
I think others did, but I'm not sure it was recorded. The Canadians ran fantastic in Boston that year, like 6 out of the top 12 or something like that, and they all crashed and burned horribly in Boston, in Yonkers. I remember Fornes, he was passed in Boston by one of the Canadians, and he never saw him again the rest of the race. The next time he saw him, the guy was slumped over a pole, 12-mile mark in Yonkers, almost unconscious. make a comment about what what you said about Edlin and running it so hard, more than necessary. What I had heard was that after that race, he started having never quite the same again.
Sciatica.
Yeah, sciatica. And McArdle in Culver City, he dehydrated so much, I think.
You're breaking up.
All right.
Abe, you still there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, now. Yep.
A lot of static. I can't hear anything.
Oh.
Yeah, the same thing down here in Texas. Can't hear hardly anything.
Here, Massachusetts. Oh.
I think it's...
Let me ask you, Hal, I'd asked you this via email, but to the group, I have this memory, or I'd heard that Norm Higgins was doing wind sprints as a warm-up at Yonkers prior to the race. Anybody recall that?
Well, I saw at Culver City that year Norm Higgins warming up with a half hour before the race, back and forth. I don't know about wind sprints, but did a lot of mileage. And the day was warm, and as Abe said, he told me that McArdle never seemed to be the same again after that marathon, which was an extremely tough finish. I think he was about 30 seconds in front of Billy Mills at the end. So I don't know whether this was the Eagloy approach or not, but it seemed to me on a warm day, you don't need any warm-up at all. You just have to, maybe half a mile or something and save it for the race.
Well, I came from a track background.
Yeah,
and typically
right.
Before any track race, I would usually jog a mile or two, stretch, although we didn't call it stretching back then, go to the toilet, and then come out and I would do some sprints, or strides really would be more appropriate. Yeah. If it were on a football field, I'd do 100 meters. I'd walk a little back, do about 100 meters back. So I might do anywhere from 3 to 4 strides, which are slower than sprints. So if Norm Higgins was doing so, it's probably because he was training with the Eagloy system and used to running with track runners. And my feeling is, and I'm feeling it's true today, that if you're going to be running your first mile in 10 minutes, 12 minutes, you probably do not need much of a warm-up to go off the starting line that slow. Plus, you're not going to be able to get it because you're going to be stuck on the starting grid for about a half hour before you get to run. But if you were a Kenyon, or if you were a Norm Higgins, I guess, and your first mile was going to be like 5 minutes, not 10 minutes, and you better get your muscles ready to go at that speed.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions, comments for Hal? Okay. Dick Weiss?
Yeah. My recollection of the Yonkers, I remember it was extremely warm. And I went down to the Glen, to the track, and people were warming up. And I happened to see Adolf Gruber. And I said to him, Adolf, are you going to make the warm-up? And he says, Nine. These people are stupid. Why do they make the warm-up? And I said to him, well, you got to get your muscles warm. Yeah, it is just warm now. My muscles are very warm. I said, you're not going to make the warm-up? Yeah, I make the warm-up. I said, when? He says, the first 10 kilometers I make the warm-up.
Yeah.
He says,
I would agree with that almost.
I'd be way behind, he said.
Yeah.
And here he finishes in 2:44, and I was just last night figuring that out. He finished second, 45 seconds a mile behind the winner.
Oh, wow.
I've never seen anything like that before in my life. You know, back then, the training was entirely different. I mean, you couldn't find out about training. There was no place to find out. When I started coaching in '63, there was nothing written. I got a book one time by Canham, and I read the book on the half miles and the milers and all like that. And I went to the coach I had at Stepanek High School, and I said to him, how can they run so fast? We're doing harder workouts than they're doing, you know. And he said to me, well, they just don't want to be called slave drivers, you know. And Adolf Gruber was the first one that would talk to me about training. And, you know, he was way ahead as far as his knowledge went. And the only way I could get him he was kind of cheap, and the only way you could get him to talk was to take him to the automat and pay for it, you know. and I think the training back then, I can remember, God bless Joe Kleineman, because he was the guy that kept road running going in New York. Yep. And every Sunday down there to McCombs Dam Park seemed like there was a race, you know. And I sure learned an awful lot. And then from going to Van Cortlandt Park and meeting with a lot of the people that ran there, you know, and then going back to what Hal said, Fred Wilt was the first one that ever put anything out in training when he had the book, How They Train.
Yep.
And that was, you know, a godsend to me, being a young coach, you know, on what to do. The running idea at the time was way different than it is today. Today, everybody has to run 5K or 10K. It's more of a big social thing and more of a health type situation. Where back then, if you ran on the road, that was only because you couldn't win on the track. That was kind of the idea of the whole thing, you know. And things just have evolved out over a long period of time. I remember when I got Fred Wilt's book, oh my God, I just started applying that to everybody in the Gaelic AC, you know, and we did extremely well, you know. And I can remember even when Milrose went the first time, went overseas and went to London to Brighton. And I think they finished second or third and then went back the next couple of years. And I guess John Gollop could tell us a lot more about that. And went back there and kicked everybody's butt, you know. But I can remember Nat Cyrilnek, he was the first one that wanted to run the ultra marathon, 52 miles. He wanted to get double credit so he could get to 100 marathons, you know. But it was, that day was brutal. I never saw so many people not finish, and I often wondered, how did they ever get back to the finish line? You know, you get 10 miles out or whatever. It was not like it is today, you know, where you get transportation back. But stood around that place like forever and watched people finish, you know. It was just a brutal, brutal day. And like you said, the course, I don't think there was much water, if any, on the course that I can remember. You know, but I didn't go all the way out on the course, and just to see what I saw was the start of the thing was 12 o'clock. God, I can remember I was soaking wet and I wasn't even warming up. You know? That's about all I can add to what everybody else has added, because you people were the runners and I wasn't. You know, I was just more of an innocent bystander at the time.
Did you coach much road running, or was it mostly track?
No, I did. When we first started out, when I first started coaching, I coached a couple of kids in cross country, and then I met a lot of people down at Van Cortlandt Park. And that was when the New York AC ran into trouble with their meet, and where it came out they wouldn't allow any blacks in the New York AC. And then the crux of the thing came out when Gary Gubner, the shot putter, wanted to join, and they wouldn't let him in, and nobody could understand or at least I didn't understand why they wouldn't let him in, and found out, the word got out that he was Jewish.
Right.
And that's when a lot of the people left the AC and started the Gaelic American Club.
Yeah.
You know. And after that, I started coaching a lot of people at the park, and Bob Fitz was one of the kids that come down in our club, and I coached him when he went up to Cortland State, and he won the NCAA, what we call Division II now, but it was big college, small college, and he won the 3 and the 6. And in cross country, he beat Amby Burfoot. And the story he told me, they were coming down the last straightaway, and he was dying. And they got just to the finish line, and he dove and landed on the ground and rolled over and looked at Amby. And Amby said, "Good race, Bob. You won." And he said, "That was fun. Let's do it again." You know. And Bob said, "I don't ever want to run against him ever again." And then right after that, Amby, came on and won the Boston Marathon.
Oh, yeah, right. 68. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Wow. Oh.
And then then after that, I just started to coaching, a lot of high school kids, a lot of kids at Sacred Heart in Yonkers, and, like that. And then started to coach in a high school and moved on from there, up to the college level.
Dick, it's Gary. How long was the Gaelic AC in existence?
Only for about 4 or 5 years. Because most of those guys, Hugh McElhaney and Tom McCarthy and Coleman Mooney. Coleman was rehabbing houses, and he made a lot of money and then got ripped off by somebody, and then he ended up going to Florida doing it. Tom McCarthy went back home. Hugh McElhaney, I don't know if you guys remember him. He had one eye, and he was up in Connecticut. And it's just the John McCarroll ran for us, and the team just dissipated after that.
What about Jim McDonough? Did he run for you?
Yeah, he ran. He was. I'll tell you some stories about him. This is a little bit off the thing. One day he came to me at Van Cortlandt Park, and he had this little purse, and he said, "Coach, you be taking me purse, and tomorrow could you be meeting me at Getty Square? He says I'd be in there at 2:30, and I'd be famished. So would you bring me purse and meet me there?" I said, "Yeah, Jim, okay." So I was living in White Plains at the time, and I drove down, got down there around 2:30 to Getty Square in Yonkers, and I parked the car. And I just waited, and no McDonough, 2:30, 2:35, 2:40. Oh, maybe he's not coming. And I was, maybe I'll go down to Van Cortlandt Park, and I'm walking back to my car, and here he comes walking out of a bar. And he says to me, there you be, come on inside. He says, and we'll have a libation here. And we went inside, and he took the purse, and he paid off whatever he owed. And the next thing I know, I had a shot in the beer, and he had a shot in the beer, and he had another shot in the beer. I don't know how many shots in beer he had. And then he says, "All right, you'll be keeping me purse, and I'll be catching you in 2 days at Van Cortlandt Park. I'd be running home." I says, "Where you running to?" And he says, "Down to the Bowery." So that was his workout, to run all the way up from down the tip of Manhattan all the way up to Yonkers and back. And he eventually
went back to. Excuse me. He eventually went back to Ireland because I was touring with a group back in, it was either 92 or 96, and we went to this small village where they had a race. It was near Galway, and Jim McDonough showed up to say hello.
Yep. And he fell out of a tree, cutting the tree down, and got killed.
Oh, no kidding. No,
they got in the car, I guess, and his wife was driving, and he got killed.
Well, before the 68 kind of sectional tryout at what's called Santa. Okay, before the 68 tryout, a sectional tryout at Holyoke, and also a very hot day. I remember seeing a small a couple of paragraphs in the paper that said that McDonough, the day before the race, was sitting on a rooftop with some friend and had, it said it, offhandedly. I don't know what to believe, that he had like 15 bottles of beer and 3 Battleship ales or whatever, some enormous amount, the day before the race.
Well, Jim did not. He used to tell me, he gave me the money because when he went out on the run, if he had money, his wife would take it away from him so he wouldn't go to the bar.
Well,
no, but he
was heard of a drinker like
he
that.
Was definitely a drinking man.
Right.
Well, this is John Gollop. Joe Kleineman would call me when we would go up. I think we went upstate for a championship. I don't know where it was, but it was a hot day. And Joe Kleineman called me up and says, "Make sure McDonough has his beer."
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah.
He was amazing. And I'll tell you what he did to me in the winter one time when we were running. He handed me tea with a shot in it. I never ran with a shot. I was coughing and thinking, what are you doing to me? But this is something he did regularly, and it worked for him.
He told us one day that he had run a 4:10 mile.
Oh, yeah?
And nobody believed him, and said, there's no way you could run a 4:10 mile. So he said, but if he trained for it, he could do it again. And nobody believed him. So he took the date, and one day he said, well, I'm ready to run the mile. And everybody laughed at him, and we went over to Van Cortlandt Park, and that sucker ran 4:17.
4:17?
Unbelievable.
Really?
Yeah, ran 4:17. Nobody could freaking believe it. And he said, and he wanted, and he thought we were all going to call him a liar because he couldn't run 4:10.
Right.
But he told me in his training that he says not to tell anybody, but he was running up to 140 miles a week.
Wow. Oh yeah, he was a mega miler. Yeah.
No, but also he used to, how he used to do his speed work? He would do pickups. I would bump into him because when I was working in the garment district, I used to run up to Central Park, and I caught him on his lunch hour. He used to go up there and do 100-meter sprints. That's when he'd do his speed work.
Wow.
Yeah, he was.
Well, getting back to Buddy Edlin, also another story connecting in because Buddy used to train. He loved his Guinness Stout, and at one point, and I think it was in Sports Illustrated, even had a picture of him with having a Guinness Stout. So he was able to make a deal with the Guinness people back in Ireland or in England to ship a carton of Guinness to Tokyo. And when the carton of Guinness appeared, the American Olympic Committee officials sort of frowned at it, and they didn't want to let him have it in the dormitories. So what they did is they kept it in the officials' room. So once a night, Buddy would come in, he would get his single Guinness and drink it there, and he kept happy.
All these revolutionary training methods we should have known before.
After that article appeared in Sports Illustrated, where he said it replaces trace minerals each day that he loses in the run. All the New York runners started drinking Guinness. Out.
Wow.
This is Gary. One comment. I remember my mother was in the stands at the finish taking video. I have videos of the finish for a number of the finishers. And she said there was someone said, where are these bums? With the long gaps, I guess after Edlin finished and he had over 20 minutes, and I think my father, there was a 5-minute gap before he came in. So there was big gaps obviously, and someone made the comment, where are these bums? Other thoughts, comments, questions?
You mentioned before about not allowing a person, a Jewish runner, to join the New York AC. I forget what group, but I've told Gary before about a runner on the BAA team, Gonzalez Scotto. We were never sure which name come first, or Scotto Gonzalez. Person that was just best humored, an excellent runner, and when we went to this goes back, we went to do a two-man marathon in '56 from Baltimore to Annapolis, something like that area, whatever comes out to 26 miles. And when we arrived, somebody at the hotel had met us. Someone asked where Scotto was. And they said, well, he's at another hotel. It's an excellent hotel, but, we'll be together tomorrow and so forth. So, Scotto was kept out of our hotel. And then I remember as late as 1961 running a marathon in Atlantic City that we were at a motel, a bunch of us just fooling around, and Scotto was with us, and motel keepers asked us, would we mind keeping Scotto in the background because Scotto was, I think, a mixture of black and Mexican. Okay? So anyways, that was an experience with racial relations at that time. And another tiny comment, too, about the size of fields. I can remember distinctly before, I believe, the early 60s, the marathon, the field was not so large or so small that Jock Semple got up in front of the group before the start of the marathon, and he was going to make a couple of announcements, and he said, you would-be runners, get in the back of the pack. And so a number of runners that had been standing up close to the front of the starting line just very slowly moved to the back of the field. So not quite possible today.
Yeah. I have a question for everybody.
Down in Texas. On the last speaker, you mentioned the Atlantic City Marathon. Could you repeat what you said? I didn't quite get that. And I was curious about that. Was that somebody from the race organization or somebody from the city?
No, it was a motel keeper. He had our rooms there, and we're just fooling around outside the motel, but I guess it was overlooking a main street, and the motel keeper wanted us to keep Scotto in the background because I guess he thought it would be bad for business.
Yeah. I wasn't sure what you said because my dad was the race director of that race. Yeah.
Oh, no, not the race director. Not at all. No.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, sure.
Just the last question for everybody. What should the history books say about the sport during this era?
Al, you're the writer, and you can analyze things better than me. Go ahead.
Well, I think that the 60s was the year that our sport started to grow. It was sort of the pre-boom, you might say, and I think it goes back to Browning Ross in 1958 organizing the Roadrunners Club of America out of the Paramount Hotel, basing it on the English model. And, of course, back in that era, there were races all up and down New England, maybe as deep as Philadelphia, Atlantic City, et cetera. But the rest of the country was a total wash, other than the Western Hemisphere Marathon at Culver City. And it was really Browning's genius, I guess, to get people together and send those of us from other parts of the country back to our hometowns to start these small little races. Pat Savage, who was later a coach at DePaul University, was running at that institution, and they had a group on the north side of Chicago, and they would run their races, and they would give the stopwatch to the fastest runner in the group, and he would run with the stopwatch until he got past, in which case he'd hand the stopwatch to the person who had just went by him, and the first runner would cross the line, and then he would time everybody else. So we've really come a long, long way from the 60s. We began the 60s with, if I recall, 1959 or 1960, we could check Tom Dederian's books with 105 people in the Boston Marathon, and we ended the 60s with 1,000 runners in the Boston Marathon, and Will Cloney and Jock Semple in a panic and instigating the qualifying standards so they could keep the race under 1,000. Well, there are a lot of factors in the 60s that caused the pre-boom to happen, but it was really sort of the beginnings of what would become in the 70s the running boom. And I've always felt that Frank Shorter, with all of his successes, winning Fukuoka 4 times, the New York City Marathon success there, Frank never took Boston seriously because they wouldn't pay him to run there. Frank really stood on the shoulders of Bud Edlund. Bud Edlund proved with his the fine record between 1962 and 1965. I think it was like 13 marathons, and he won 7 of them, set a world record in 1. Proved that Americans could run the equal of the people in the rest of the world. And I suppose you could say that although Buddy had run a 2:14 in the Poly, Yonkers in 1964 really was his greatest moment, his greatest success. Forget the time, but consider the conditions, and he was at his best on that day, and maybe shortened his career a little bit, but he was the runner of the 60s. We had some other great track runners, but Buddy, for all the success that Johnny Kelly had in the previous decade, definitely was the great American runner in the 60s, and was part of the reason why people began to get all the publicity that he gotten. Saturday Evening Post, Sports Illustrated began to attract runners to our little sport.
That's very good, Hal. Wonderful.
There's a few other people that tried to credit. Bob Anderson with starting the magazine, Distance Running News, the precursor to Runner's World, seems to want to take credit for the running boom too. And not only the Road Runners Club, but I think the introduction of races like Run for Your Life and Fun Runs that got was another thing that led to mass participation.
Well, for New England, nothing could equal the contribution of, this is maybe avalanche runners, Bob Campbell, Fred Brown, and Chuck Semple, of course. They kept the sport alive in the 50s and handed off to the 60s that became this running boom that Hal so beautifully describes.
Any other closing thoughts?
Well, one thing, and it relates partly to your father, Gary. I remember running back in the 60s as a lot more egalitarian than it is today in some respects, because we were whites and we were blacks, and the blacks are all part of our gathering. I think I learned certainly social graces because of the great Negro runners that I had, who came under my knowledge under Ted Hayden at the University of Chicago. One of the runners on the track club was Dick Gregory, the comedian, who had been a half-mile record holder at Southern Illinois University, and came up, joined the club, and 3 years later he was famous as the great comedian. So a lot of the people that I met at this time certainly influenced me to have a much broader feeling for what's right in this world than if I had just been on my own and living in the normal white society that we had back then.
That's excellent.
I would second. This is Pete Ligg. I would second Hal's comments there about the integration of the sport. There was no such thing as integration. We were just black and white. We were all together, and we were runners. One of my fondest memories of a workout was Leon Dreer from Philadelphia called me one time. I lived down in Atlantic City, He said, let's work out this weekend. So I came up to Philadelphia, and it was a snowstorm like you wouldn't believe. And we did a 10 to 12 miler in Fairmount Park in a blizzard conditions. And both Leon and I looked at each other and said, we're never going to forget this night. This was just great. And that's the kind of camaraderie we had back there, at least in the Philadelphia and South Jersey area. Yeah.
That's very good.
You know, Hal and I have talked about how the sport did a lot of civil rights. New York Pioneer Club, an integrated club, started by three black gentlemen in 1936. University of Chicago Track Club were both leaders in integration.
And I could talk to you about the same thing happening in South Africa at the end of the 70s when I visited, but you don't want to be on the phone for another half hour with those memories.
Okay.
When we're together, Gary, we'll go out and have a Guinness Stout, and we can discuss all that.
Yeah. Everybody, this has been great. It really has. This is just what we need to just document the sport, and because as you know, history is very fleeting, and we got to record all this, and so that future generations will know the history correctly. And so I thank everybody for your participation. And
Gary,
I'll be in touch.
Gary,
yes.
Yeah, I'll just give you. I wasn't a runner when I was younger in school or anything like that, but I met a Millrose man named Bill Steiner. I don't know if you ever met him. He was an old timer. He was a champion.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And he's the one that got me into the running. I mean, I remember the first race I went to was a 4-miler, and I met Kurt Steiner, Matt Cyrilnik. Matt Cyrilnik got me into the Roadrunners Club for $2, and he sold me the long-distance log. Aldo Scandura, and I met your father. All of these men that made road running in New York fantastic in 1960. That's how I started off, and I have that memory of all these gentlemen that I met.
Hey, John.
60 in my first race.
John.
Yeah.
And Yonkers, just to bring you up to date, Aldo ran 3:07, finished 17th.
Yeah. Well, he's the one that asked me to join the Roadrunners Club when I finished second behind him.
I remember that. I remember him
in the 30K.
Yeah, only invite people you know you can beat, so to finish behind you.
Well, let me tell you, that 61, when they had started their program, and they had about 3 or 4 races, and then we had 17 inches of snow, and there was a 20-miler. And I lived right off the course. I figured if I go down there, I could win this race. So who shows up? Gordon McKenzie and Ted Corbett, 2 Olympians, and they finished 1-2 in the race. Well, 10 guys showed up and 8 finished in 17 inches of snow. They never shoveled a thing. That was...
Well, you should have done a Jimmy McDonough training routine, which I may adopt very soon.
Well, I remember him many times coming up behind me saying, "Oh, John, you're looking good today," and he'd go right by me.
That's a good Irish accent. That's good.
These stories are tremendous. These tremendous stories. Tremendous stories. Okay, everybody.
Gary, thank you for putting us together. Great job.
Yes.
Okay, everybody.
That's
Thank you,
fantastic.
Gary.
Bring back.
Thank you,
another week. Your father too.
Good show, Gary.
What do you say? Hasta la vista, baby.
Okay.
Take care, everybody. I'll be in touch.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
All right. Bye.